Hi everyone. In this lesson we're going to conclude our analysis of human social interaction and social structure by looking at two interesting approaches. The first is known as ethnomethodology. There is some information on page 14 in your second study guide that highlights this approach, and you will also find information in chapter 4 in your text. Ethnomethodology as an approach was pioneered by Garfinkel, and essentially what he implies by that, and you can focus on the working definition that I've included on page 14, is that everyday social interaction is characterized by a bunch of informal assumptions, kind of taken for granted ground rules, if you will. And these are so pervasive and so taken for granted that we don't always recognize them. So he encouraged his students to engage in breaching exercises. I'll repeat, breaching exercises, all designed to acquaint them with the significance of these informal guidelines or rules, if you will. And in doing so, it was a little bit like this. Take stuff out of people's shopping carts for science. And essentially, what he encouraged his students to do is to go out and literally, again, in everyday interaction, take the time, make the effort to violate some of these unspoken assumptions about behavior. For example, at a checkout at a retail store, volunteer to pay more than the posted price for an item. Or in this case, actually take things out of people's shopping carts at a grocery store. If, again, you are questioned as to why you're doing it, you could respond, well, it was just more convenient for me to pick it up there than to reach high up on the shelf. Garfinkel also encouraged his students to imagine themselves as boarders in their own home. And he was very quick to point out, again, address your mother and father as if, in effect, you don't know them. You would address them formally by Mr. and Mrs. Of course, this requires keeping a straight face, if you will. Ask them for formal permission to join them for the evening meal, to turn on the television, or to retire to your room. I suspect if any of you were to attempt this in your own home, it wouldn't take very long until you'll get some very interesting responses from your parents. Now you can exaggerate this, as these three have done, in a restaurant. Again, rather than conversing verbally, they've written comments which they're holding in their mouths. Imagine how other customers at the restaurant might regard these folk. Garfinkel himself pointed out a couple of more or less generalized rules, and they've been given interesting titles. Searching for the normal form. Start a conversation with your friends. Focus on a topic that really is going to pique their interest. And when they really get heavily involved in the conversation, strike off onto an entirely unrelated topic. Notice how they respond. Sometimes you'll get comments like, "What are you smoking?" On the other hand, you get these really interesting facial expressions, sort of a cross between "I'm constipated" and "I've got diarrhea." But they're going to let you know to return to what's normal for the given conversation. It might be something as straightforward as, "Hey fool, we're not talking about that. What in the world are you doing?" Another interesting informal guideline he referred to as the etc. principle. And perhaps you converse with people who frequently, when they are talking with you, they'll throw in an and they'll continue talking, and shortly thereafter they'll follow it up with "you know." So it's sort of blah 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 blah, you know. Well, the next time they do that, let them go for a little bit, and then again, key with a straight face, just say, "Time out. You keep throwing in, what does that have to do with anything? And you keep asking me, No, I don't know. I'm totally confused. Now, if you can keep a straight face, it'll be interesting to see how these people respond to your comments and observations. Because most of us recognize when someone throws in the uhs and knows and follow, usually that indicates to us, the listener, they're in control. They're telling us they're still in control. They're telling us, I realize that what I've shared with you up to this point may not make a lot of sense. Hang in there, I'm organizing my thoughts. In a few minutes, I'll clarify everything for you. This approach, again, is known as ethnomethodology. Another example you might experiment with. Go into a retail store and mistake, quote unquote, customers for salespersons or servers. Particularly if these folks are, shall we say, well-to-do, they may not take your comments and your approach in a necessarily positive way. You can be creative when it comes to violating these informal guidelines. And again, if you decide you're going to do something like this, be cautious because people take these very seriously. Now, dramaturgy was an approach developed by Goffman. And if you'll notice there, working definition is just as you see there. It employs the analogy of the stage. We're all actors. There are scripts that we follow. Now, there's also an audience to which we play. Now, if the script breaks down, if it's ineffective, as efficient actors, we improvise. So what's central to this is actors following the scripts. If the scripts don't exist, we again improvise, but there's always a stage manager to let us know if we go too far. Furthermore, another central feature is what he referred to as image, sometimes called presentation of self, but Goffman referred to it as impression management. Notice again what it implies or means. We really try to present ourselves so as to create or generate a favorable response. We want to create a particular impression on others. How do we do this? Well, one way we may very well do this is by manipulating the props. Now, the props can literally be anything. Books, furniture, office space, framed degrees, specific titles, and even equipment of one sort or the other. Furthermore, demeanor is another element that we tend to employ when we're trying to, again, generate particular impressions of ourselves. Demeanor means the way we carry ourselves. And interesting, it's often linked to power. The more powerful often tend to, for example, dominate conversations. They're more likely to interrupt others. And they usually have more freedom when it comes to their own actions. For example, a boss or an employer may be able to do a lot of things that employees can't. Make off-color comments, swear, touch, and that sort of thing. Another element that figures into this is space and its use. Once again, power plays an important role here. The more power one has, the more space that individual tends to employ. Space usually signifies who has privilege, status, and power. And generally speaking, the higher you are in the socioeconomic scale, the greater your consumption of space. So no great surprise to any of you, the wealthy usually have huge homes. Executives have what kind of offices? Big offices. Lower ranked workers tend to have cubicles, if you will. Now, it was also interesting in his approach, and this is something that might highlight what he referred to as impression management. Notice again, probably one of the best examples that can be made or used to illustrate impression management, a job interview, making the first impressions on the job itself. Firm handshake, formal dress, neat, cleanly shaved, trimmed hair, etc. Smiling, exuding a sense of confidence, if you will. Think again about other examples of impression management you've engaged in. For example, first date. Now, at the same time, what was interesting about Goffman's approach is he made a clear distinction between what he called front stage and backstage. Okay? Front stage is generally where we tend to make efforts toward effective impression management. We're on stage, we're in front of a lot of other people. And he highlighted the fact that you can see this in a restaurant. Out in the dining room area, working with customers, servers, again, go out of their way, even when they're dealing with kind of snooty and kind of lousy customers, if you wish, they employ impression management. They're smiling, they're conversing, they're being considerate. But once they go through the swinging door into the kitchen area, everything changes. Their demeanor, their behavior, even their speech. And they might really unload on a particular customer they don't like. At home, think about rooms that are set aside for backstage behavior. Give you a hint. The two rooms I have in mind both have locks on them. On the other hand, front room, occasionally again the family room, the dining room, more often not, those are set aside for front stage behavior, where we're trying again to manage effective impressions. Now, remember that people work to create performances that will be convincing and significant to others. But sometimes, again, we may have real difficulty doing that. We may find ourselves more or less between the proverbial rock and a hard place. We want to impress other people, but we're not being as effective as we might like. So I want you to highlight a couple of other key points as we close this off. One is aligning actions. And this is sort of a way you could look at aligning actions. Once again, our desire is to present ourselves in the most favorable way. Well, what if we can't? What if it blows up in our faces as such? Well, sometimes we can make verbal statements intended to, again, remove any kind of negativity associated with this. We can make fun of ourselves, for example. But sometimes we're also going to use excuses or justifications. Well, I've been under a lot of pressure. I didn't mean to blow up in your face. Please accept my apology. You know I'm not that kind of a person. Well, I've never done this before. I was never really good at activities similar to it. I'll probably go out and make a complete ass of myself. So if I do, you all just laugh at me and act like you don't know me. Now, if you'll look at these aligning actions, once again, they're designed to maintain, in some form or fashion, effective impression management. So often what we're going to be doing is presenting ourselves so that the impression is we're behaving in the most appropriate way and for the most appropriate reasons. It's what McShonis refers to as idealization. And if anybody's ever asked you the question, well, why did you choose your current career? You might respond in a highly idealized way. Well, I want to help others. I'm answering a higher calling. I want to make a contribution to my community. Now, rarely will we go out of our way to admit the main reason we selected our career is because of its benefits. Offers good money, plenty of time away from work, and that sort of thing. So all of us, to one degree or the other, are going to employ idealization. Very simple example McShonis uses. Have you ever smiled and been polite and engaged in friendly conversation with someone that really you hate, you detest? Have you ever acted interested in a conversation or a classroom lecture, which you really thought to be boring and stupid? You understand where I'm coming from? And something else you want to bear in mind, the importance of tact. Most of us don't want to embarrass folks. We don't want to put them between the proverbial rock and a hard place. Embarrassment impacts everybody. It makes everyone ill at ease. So if somebody drops the ball, screws up, commits a faux pas, we tend to recognize, hey, next time that could be me. So we tend to go out of our way to kind of work together to ease away as much as possible any embarrassment. We just, again, tend to overlook potentially embarrassing actions or behaviors of others. Again, in a formal dinner, someone's stomach rumbles loudly, or worse, they pass gas. Or you've been introduced to this high-status individual wearing a toupee and it's askew. More often than not, people are going to overlook this. They may snicker in the back of their minds, but they're not going to bring it to the attention of the person. If you were in a regular class with me and I was standing up in front of the class with my fly wide open, I suspect some of you would be hesitant to bring it to my attention because you don't want to embarrass me. Because if I get embarrassed, you get embarrassed. Now, one other key factor to finish off with that makes, again, human social interaction so fascinating. It's what's referred to as civil inattention. And this is an example. In public places, we tend to politely ignore strangers. By doing so, we're telling them, hey, you've got nothing to fear from me, but I expect you to return the favor. That's why I suspect most of you, certainly I know I would, if I were in a crowded area like this, and this stranger leans over, puts his or her arm around me, and then engages me in a lot of very personal questions. How many times do you go to the bathroom? Questions about my sexuality. All very private in nature. I can tell you right now, if I were on a crowded elevator car, I'd be crawling the walls. We don't expect it because we see it as threatening. So civil inattention is you and I being polite, and we're really, in effect, politely ignoring strangers in public places. Now, if you take all these into account, you begin to recognize, hey, social interaction isn't quite as simple as it seems. Until next time.